Hello, I am very glad that I have the opportunity to meet you all. The survivors that came from Carpathian Ruthenia, Carpata Rus, and the second generation and the third. I myself was born in Israel. I'm second generation as well. My parents came from Poland. I would like to thank especially Mr. Ze'ev Milbauer, the chairman of your organization in Israel, and also Yad Vashem in Jerusalem, that has enabled us to hold the present meeting. Although indirectly by film, not a personal meeting, neither in Israel nor in other countries. But we hope that these difficult times will pass shortly. My name is Aryeh Barnea. I'm an educator. I was principal of 4 separate high schools in Israel during more than 20 years. I'm the chairman of Amcha, the organization that assists Holocaust survivors all over Israel, psychologically and socially. And I have been, for about 20 years, a lecturer in the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. My course there is called The Holocaust and the Law. We are discussing today the topic of Jewish leadership during the Holocaust. Question number 1 should be, was there any leadership? Because a leader must be able to make decisions to determine the fate of his community or her community. And in the Holocaust, the Jewish so-called leaders were, in most cases, unable to make decisions, or they could make as many decisions as they wanted. But the Nazis were the ones who determined the fate of the Jewish communities. And regardless of the efforts carried out by the so-called leaders, eventually, in most cases, the Nazis murdered the Jewish communities in so many cities and villages and countries. Over a third of the entire Jewish people, and maybe 75% of the Jews who were living under the rule of the Nazis and their allies. So we can identify those Jews who were officials, who were elected leaders, or leaders appointed by the Nazis. But it seems that they could not have any considerable influence over the fate of their communities. This is question number 1. Number 2 is, what was their aim? Was there anything they could achieve? And I think that when we think about this aspect, we identify those people who were real leaders under impossible circumstances, which is an optimistic statement, because if one may affect, influence the fate of his community under those circumstances, then we, of course, under normal circumstances, may change our fate always. Number 1 were the leaders of the Jewish councils. Those organs were called in German, in singular, Judenrat, in plural, Judenräte, councils of the Jews. They were elected or appointed, including the leader, the chairman of this specific Judenrat, by the Germans. And they functioned as a municipality with no resources, almost. And they also were the contact people between the community and the Germans. They got orders from the Germans, transferred them to the community, argued with the Germans regarding the nature of those instructions, and also tried to represent the Jews before the Nazis. The other group was the group of the members of the fighting underground all over the place, in many communities and ghettos, especially in Eastern Europe, also in other places. Young people who had some weapons and did their best at fighting against the Nazis, not order to stop the war, not order to stop the Holocaust. They knew they could not. but in order to save at least the Jewish dignity. As one of them, the leader of the underground in Białystok, Poland, Mordechai Tenenbaum Tamarov, said, "We are fighting in order to win 3 lines in history." The third group was a group of Jewish public figures who did their best at rescuing Jews. In many cases, those 3 functions, representation, armed fighting against the Nazis, and rescue, were combined, because the same people, the same public figures, dealt with more than one function, more than one goal. But we can identify in Jewish history during the Holocaust a group of the Jewish councils and the members, the group of young underground movements, and the group of people from various social fragments that tried to save as many Jews as they could. Number 1, the Judenrat. In many cases after the Holocaust, and even during the Holocaust, the Jews themselves, that I'm not going to judge because I have no idea how I would behave under such circumstances, hated those appointed leaders and blamed them for the death of their families. And we know that in most cases, those Jewish leaders did hand over Jews to the Nazis. Why did they do it? Because they were frightened, because it was imposed on them, but also because they thought that if they did not give away 1,000 Jews, the Nazis at the same time will take 2,000 or 5,000. And that was the truth. That was the nature of the Nazi threat. And eventually, in most cases, when Jewish leaders refused to assist the Nazis or failed to assist them, the Nazis themselves, plus local collaborators, Polish, Ukrainian, and others, did the job themselves. Eventually, those Jewish communities were annihilated by the Nazis, and we understand that in many cases, when those leaders refused to obey the Nazis or failed to obey them, the Nazis, plus their local collaborators, Polish, Ukrainian, and others, did kill more Jews than earlier. So the question mark posed by those Jewish leaders is understandable. Let us bring a few examples. Let us start by mentioning the biggest Jewish city under the rule of the Nazis, Warsaw, the capital of Poland. The Warsaw ghetto consisted of Jews from all possible social fragments, altogether about 500,000 Jews. The Jews of Warsaw were living under impossible conditions, hunger and disease, and they were deported to their death. Many of them died in the ghetto because of those impossible living conditions. But most of the dead were deported to Treblinka and other places and killed there. We know that the head of the Jewish Judenrat, the engineer Adam Chernyakov, did his best as so-called mayor, and eventually in obeying the Nazis, but trying and struggling for improving the living conditions of the community. When he got the order in July 1942 to gather hundreds of thousands of Jews, he eventually understood that that order was aimed at deporting the Jews to their death. And he, in fact, refused to obey. And he committed suicide. But the Nazis came, and with the help of other Jewish officials, including the next chairman of the Jewish Council, Lichtenboim, they did exactly as planned. We have no questions to Chernyakov. We understand his feeling at that impossible time. but he did not rescue the community. And this is what we are interested in, rescuing our Jews. We want to see them alive. And he was unable to reach this goal, and so was Lichtenboim, and they functioned differently. But eventually we understand that they could not help. They could not enable their community to survive. Number two, Lublin in central Poland. A big city, not as big as Warsaw, of course, headed by Jewish Council, led by Mr. Becker. The nature of his behavior was in most cases just obeying the Nazis. Can we blame him? He was frightened. He also understood that if he refused, he would cause the Nazis to annihilate his community earlier. And we understand that he wanted to lengthen the lives of the Jews in his community in Lublin. So we don't find in his behavior special aspects of heroism. Nevertheless, we understand his feeling and his considerations, and of course the Jewish community of Lublin was annihilated like other communities. Let's mention Vilna in Lithuania. In the local language it was called Vilnius. It was not the capital, and it's not their capital today of the Lithuanians. It is a major city, the cultural capital for many generations. Jews in many countries used for generations to call the Jewish Vilna Jerusalem of Lithuania. Now this community, much smaller, about 10% if we compare it to Warsaw, they were led by a Jewish council whose chairman was appointed by the Nazis. His name was Yaakov Gens. He had been a fighting officer in a Lithuanian army. He was a Zionist, married to a Gentile lady. Nevertheless, he was planning to make Aliyah to come to the land of Israel. He belonged to the Zionist right-wing party, to Beitar movement, and he was the right person to try and lead the Jewish community under those circumstances. Gens understood quite fast that he had to hand over Jews to forced labor. If he said no, the fate of the community would be worse. He had to hand over Jews that eventually will be taken to Ponar or Ponaria and other places and will never come back. But he should do it as slowly as possible, hand over as few Jews as he could, and pray that the Russians come fast and rescue the remaining part of the community. In his community, there was an underground led by a communist whose name was Itzik Wittenberg, together with Zionist activists from the right-wing and left-wing youth movements. From Shomer Tzair, from Beitar, the poet Abba Kovner was his deputy, from the left-wing party, and from the right-wing party, Beitar movement, Yosef Glasman and others. And they cooperated in order to reach the joint goal of the underground, to fight against the Nazis. Gens, the chairman, sympathized with them, and he used to meet them secretly and tell them that he understood them, and he also wanted to fight against the Nazis. But he thought it was not practical at the time. It was too dangerous to fight against the Nazis when the punishment will be the total, immediate death of your community. The Nazis found some information about the underground, and they ordered Gens to find for them the leader Wittenberg. So he did, because he knew that thousands of Jews will pay the price if Wittenberg did not come forward. Eventually, the underground succeeded in releasing its commander from the Nazi arrest, and the headquarters gathered secretly in some bunker in order to make decisions. Eventually, Wittenberg went to the Gestapo, and he understood that he had to give away his life to save not only the underground, but some of the community. So only 6 weeks later, in September 1st, 1943, the Nazis took the remaining Jews to Barnea to be killed. And maybe his heroism enabled the Jews to survive another 6 weeks, which is something. He did his best. But that underground, sad and beaten and with heartache, decided eventually that on that special and horrible day of September 1st, they were escaped to the forest. So they did. They became a fighting unit against the Nazis from the forest. Do we have any retroactive advice for against what we would have done under those circumstances? I don't think we've got an answer. There was one Judenrat, at least one, that made very early a decision to become an underground movement and fight against the Nazis. The Judenrat made that decision. In Tuchin, in the Ukraine, a small community, out of fighting 3,000 Jews, headed by the head of the Judenrat, Getzel Schwarzman, 20 survived. He did his best, and we respect him and his memory. But we understand that if what we wish to see is the survival of the community, that was not the way to achieve it. And he, Schwarzman, understood this very well. Let's mention another 2 communities in which the heads of the Judenrat did their best, although not all Jews thought they were doing their best, and even after the Holocaust. Many Jews would argue that what I'm saying right now is too positive. And if they were the head of the Jewish Council, they would behave differently. When a survivor said this, I listened. When a person from the second generation said it, like myself, I think we can argue about this hypothesis. Number 1 would be Lodz, a big city in Poland, an industrial city, the second biggest ghetto, 250,000 Jews, headed by the elderly person, Mr. Rumkowski, Mordechai Chaim Rumkowski, a religious Jew, approaching his 70s at the time, that had been the director, the principal of an orphanage in Lodz, a big institution, and he was known as a good principal. And then he became the gabbai in the central synagogue of Lodz. Rumkowski was a hard person, and he was a real leader, and he could make decisions. And after some time he understood that the Nazis were going to persecute and kill his community. He decided to turn his entire community into a big factory with various departments that would supply the Nazis with equipment of all kinds, not military equipment, but any kind of equipment, like clothing, that they could produce and supply the Nazis with for free. The Nazis understood that this special ghetto means for them money, much money, wealth, privately for some Nazis, and as far as the state was concerned. And therefore his goal was achieved. Rumkowski saw that the speed in which the Nazis deport Jews to their death in Auschwitz and other places was much slower than other places, in other ghettos. They did not want to lose the economical advantage that those Jews were giving them. Many Jews hated Rumkowski because he imposed on them to work for the Nazis. But he used to tell them, after the war, we shall go to a Beit Din, to a Jewish court, and we shall explain our positions. And I know exactly what the Beit Din will say about what I'm doing right now. But today, you do what I say. And later on, he used to say, when he understood he was not going to survive, when all of us come to heaven before God Almighty, we shall say what we think, and I shall be judged. But right now, you do what I say. On October 4th, 1943, the head of the SS, Himmler, gathered the high-ranking officers of the SS, and they made a toast in order to note the event that no other ghetto in Poland existed. All of them were annihilated, besides the Lodz ghetto. Rumkowski, so it seems, succeeded. In summer 1944, there were still 60,000 Jews in Lodz. And the Russians were quite near Lodz. They approached that big city. But they had all sorts of military considerations. They did not enter Lodz in July 44, but only in January 45. In the middle, in summer 1944, the Nazis took the remaining Jews, almost 60,000, to Auschwitz, including Rumkowski himself. It is possible that the way we see Rumkowski today could be altered if we knew that he saved, in his special way, 60,000 people. It was the only ghetto which reached July 44. But maybe we would have said other things, even if he saved them. We could say that it's not an achievement of the Judenrat. We could say that we are thinking about those Jews, many more, almost 200,000, they were killed by the Nazis. But the question is very hard and bitter. And I think that none of us has got a recipe for Rumkowski or for other Jewish leaders. Let's mention an important city in Carpathian Ruthenia, in Carpatho Rus, Munkac or Mukachevo. We know that in this city, the Nazis built two ghettos. They were led by Zoltan, and then especially by Steiner. And I believe they did their best, including establishing public kitchen for the hungry Jews. But eventually, the Nazis deported all Jews from those two ghettos, one after the other, to Auschwitz and killed them, including their leaders. Let's say a few words about the underground movements. Those young groups, especially young people, naturally, they thought about fighting against the Nazis with weapons. We see the Jews fought against the Nazis more than any other conquered nation. This statement contradicts the belief that Jews went like sheep to the slaughter and never fought back. I do not have a retroactive demand of the Jews that they fight. All I want to see is that Jews survive. And the demand that they become soldiers is irrelevant in my eyes. Although I respect very much those few Jews who were able to achieve some weapons and fight against the Nazis. We know that, generally speaking, the underground movements postponed the war against the Nazis. And some of the survivors, and some of the second generation, even the third, used to ask those old fighters, why so late? We understand, number one, that they postponed the fighting because they did not want to cause the Nazis to annihilate the community earlier. They wanted life more than dignity that is involved with actual fighting. Number two, I would ask, not how come you fought back so late, but how come you fought back? This is the almost impossible event that took place. We understand that in many cases, the community was angry at those youngsters and wanted to avoid any revolt. And those underground movements in many cases were angry at the other Jews. All what parents wanted to see was that their children will be saved. And that was not the main issue that bothered the underground movements, because they understood that everybody is going to die. And the only relevant question was, how are we going to die? In the Warsaw Ghetto, there were two underground movements. The difference was political. The right wing and the left wing. Left wing, the big underground movement, 1,000 Jews. As to the fighting underground movements, we are of course aware of the activity of that movement in the Warsaw Ghetto. In fact, there were two separate movements. One belonged to the left wing of the Zionist movement, led by Mordechai Anilevich. The main underground group consisted of, we remember of course, the underground movement in the Warsaw Ghetto. The biggest ghetto, the biggest movement, a revolt that is known to all of us. It is a symbol that we have dealt with in our educational system, in other frameworks, since 1943 or 45 up till now. We are aware, of course, of the special activity of the underground movement in the Warsaw Ghetto. The biggest ghetto, the biggest underground movement. In fact, two movements. One belonged to the left wing of the Zionist movement, headed by Mordechai Anilevich. The right wing was represented, so to speak, by the underground movement that was called Atzi. They had connection with Beitar right-wing movement. And all of them rebelled against the Nazis. But the connections between both groups were not strong enough in order to form one movement. And we are not happy about this. We're not happy about the fact that since then, up till recent years, most of us have not heard about the right-wing movement that rebelled against the Nazis. The reasons regarding the Israeli or Zionist establishment were, of course, political. We understand that as to Anilevich's deputy, Marek Edelman, who became a physician in Warsaw, his name was almost a secret for many years because he was a communist, and political considerations were relevant, so we see, even in times of war and Holocaust, and even more so later on. Nevertheless, the very revolt that took place in April and May 1943 was a huge event that astonished the Nazis themselves. We saw that the final report submitted by General Stopf to the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, seems as if they conquered Russia. It was so difficult for them, so surprising for them, that they needed whole 3 weeks in order to overcome a small rebellion, small revolt of the Jewish underground movement. And they even see women fighting against them with weapons. Everything that was impossible in their eyes took place. And for us, of course, it is a symbol And we teach every generation anew to realize how heroic it was, and what kind of source of inspiration it should be for us and for next generations. I would like to remind us all that in Poland alone, we saw 44 attempts of revolt and of organized rescue. We know today that in Poland alone, Jews, especially young Jews, carried out at least 44 separate attempts of revolt, organized revolt against the Nazis, more than other nations. We know today that in all the region conquered by the Nazis, Jews carried out about 200 attempts of organized rescue or organized revolt, more than other nations, beside Yugoslavia and Russia, in which the former army was part of the underground movement of the non-Jewish population. But in other places, Jews fought back more than others. I don't have any demand of any nation to overcome the Nazis. But I do think that the fact that we have accused so many times Jews during the Holocaust in going to their death like sheep to the slaughter is a shame. Any Jew that survived is a miracle, is a hero or she, and especially those Jews who fought back. Jewish underground movements postponed as much as they could the revolt. In some cases, we know that was a source of criticism against them later on. But why did they postpone the revolt? Because they understood that if they carried out earlier, the Nazis would annihilate the Jewish community earlier. And every day of life is a gift, and they should enable the entire community to survive at least another month, at least another day. I think the relevant question is not why they fought back so late, but how was it possible that they fight back with weapons? This seems impossible, but it did take place. I would like to mention another underground movement, which I think is the most secret ones. I would like to mention another underground movement, which I believe is the most secret one. Most of us have not heard about it. The underground in Algeria. Algeria was living at the time for about 2 years and more under the French regime of the Vichy regime, fascist, anti-Semitic, ally of the Nazis. There was some presence of German officers. And the beginning of the fate of the Jews in North Africa was similar to the fate of Jews in other countries, in European countries. But those communities were saved from total annihilation because the Americans and the British came to North Africa and won the war earlier than in Europe, in 1942-43. The persecution was exactly the kind of persecution we met in Europe, carried out by the Nazis and their allies and collaborators. In Algeria, there was a young group of 362 Jews and 15 Frenchmen that organized a so-called revolt. They took over the city of Algiers, the capital, and handed it over to the Americans without any necessity on the American side to wage war in Algiers within 20 hours. And we understand that this speed also contributed to the survival of the Jewish community in Algeria. Because had the Nazis stayed longer, we understand they were about to do exactly what they did in other countries in Europe. The head of the underground movement in Algeria, in the city of Algiers, was José Youssef Aboulker, later on a physician in Paris, a communist. The Jews belonged to any possible political fragment of the community, and they did a courageous deed by taking over the capital and ending the war between the Nazis and the Frenchmen and the Americans in this region. Let us say a few words about the ultra-Orthodox community in many countries. Their fate was exactly like the fate of other communities and other fragments. The difference is that many of the ultra-Orthodox Jews believed that God Almighty will save them. And they eventually saw that their fate was exactly like the one of the secular Jews or non-religious. And secondly, they obeyed their rabbis. In some cases, the rabbis escaped. In others, the rabbis kept quiet. In other cases, they tried to help their community. We have got a recipe for the rabbis. Of course, we don't have one for the entire ultra-Orthodox communities. But of course, we remember that in those cases, let us say a few words about the ultra-Orthodox Haredic communities in many countries, including Hungary, a big relevant population. The fate of the ultra-Orthodox Jews was similar to that of other communities. Two differences. One, many ultra-Orthodox Jews expected that God Almighty will help them, will save them. And this did not happen. The second difference is the rabbis that they obeyed could not help them also. In some cases, even escaped and left their communities alone. We understand that the rabbi, like other people, wanted to save himself and his family. We also understand the disappointment of the community, whose leader vanished. It is very difficult to listen to those testimonies of ultra-Orthodox Jews from the Holocaust. Some of them became secular after the war, but the very important fact, the most important fact, is that the fate of those Jews was exactly like the fate of other Jews. And I think we should demonstrate sympathy to those sisters and brothers of ours, like we express regarding the entire Jewish people under the rule of the Nazis and their allies. The behavior of the rabbis was not one unit. We understand that in many cases rabbis tried to assist their community, but usually failed. One last remark regarding the attempts of rescue. We understand that such attempts took place in many countries, in many cities. In most cases, they were unsuccessful under the circumstances. They were very vast, and in some cases successful, in two countries. One was France, and the other was Hungary. Let's say a few words about Hungary. That is, of course, relevant to your region as well. We see in Hungary two major groups of public figures, young and adult, that did its best at rescuing Jews. And also a few guidelines of attempt to rescue others. One was the activity of the Zionist youth movement that forged papers, that organized escape to other countries, that organized some hiding places in Hungary for children and others, and its contribution was magnificent. We see public figures, especially in the Zionist movement, some of whom thought that they should negotiate with the Hungarians that may help them. Others that they should negotiate with foreign diplomats. And yet, still others, especially Israel Kastner, the famous public figure, thought that negotiating with the Nazis themselves should be the solution, because the Nazis were able to stop the annihilation, the deportation, and some of them had a private interest in doing so. They could get some money, they could organize their personal flight after the war, they could win the support of some Jewish public figures, Kastner himself, that could testify in their favor after the war if they rescue Jews during the war. We know the criticism regarding Kastner for many years. I would like to say right now what I believe regarding Kastner and other Jews, that any attempt at rescuing Jews, especially successful attempt, like other figures, Kraus and Komoy and youth movements, and Kastner himself in Hungary, any such attempt is a heroic act. And we should salute to those people who did their best at rescuing Jews, not in the quantities or numbers we would like to see, and not exactly the groups that we would like to see saved, but in fact we wanted to see the entire community saved, and we should thank those people who managed to save one person or two or maybe many thousand. Thank you very much.